Officer Bradley Jenkins thought he had cornered the perfect victim, a quiet black man driving a high-end classic car through an affluent neighborhood after midnight. Jenkins expected fear. He expected submission. He expected another easy notch on his belt of unchallenged authority. What he didn't expect was that the man he violently dragged from his vehicle, humiliated and falsely charged, was a highly decorated retired Marine colonel with a direct line to the Department of Justice. By the time the dust settled, Jenkins' untouchable career would be reduced to ashes, and the entire police department would be completely dismantled. This is a story of absolute arrogance meeting hard, unforgiving karma. Stick around, because the twist in this one will leave you entirely speechless. The night was slick with a fresh, relentless autumn rain, the kind that made the streetlights bleed across the dark asphalt of Oak Ridge County. It was a wealthy, quiet suburban enclave where the houses sat far back from the road, hidden behind wrought iron gates and ancient, sprawling oak trees. Felix Pendleton was enjoying the drive. At 62 years old, Felix was a man who appreciated the quiet moments. He had spent the better part of his life in environments where silence was a luxury. 30 years in the United States Marine Corps, completing multiple tours in the most hostile environments on the planet. Now retired, his greatest thrill was the low, guttural purr of his fully restored midnight blue 1968 Shelby GT500. He had spent 4 years rebuilding the engine with his own hands, a therapeutic exercise that helped him leave the ghosts of war behind. 2 miles away, sitting idling in a darkened intersection, was Officer Bradley Jenkins. Jenkins was a 10-year veteran of the Oak Ridge Police Department, a man who had built a reputation on aggressive policing and a barely concealed contempt for anyone who didn't fit his narrow worldview. To Jenkins, a badge wasn't a shield to protect the community, it was a hammer, and he was always looking for a nail. His personnel file was a thick stack of excessive force complaints, racial profiling accusations, and intimidation tactics. Yet thanks to a complacent union rep and a cowardly precinct captain, Jenkins had always slithered out of trouble, solidifying his dangerous belief that he was entirely above the law. As Felix Shelby cruised past the intersection, the gleam of the streetlights catching the pristine chrome bumper, Jenkins' eyes narrowed. He pulled out, the tires of his cruiser hissing on the wet pavement, and began tailing the classic car. Inside the Shelby, Felix noticed the headlights immediately. Decades of combat training had hardwired a 360-degree situational awareness into his brain. He checked his speedometer 35, in a 35 zone. Both hands were at the 10 and 2 positions. His blinker was used a full 100 feet before his turn. He was doing everything perfectly, but Felix knew with a heavy, familiar sinking feeling in his chest that perfection rarely mattered. Jenkins ran the plates. They came back clean. Registered to Felix Pendleton. No warrants, no priors. A spotless record. It should have ended there. But Jenkins, fueled by a toxic cocktail of bias and boredom, decided that a black man in a $100,000 vintage car in Oak Ridge at 1000 NLR is inherently suspicious. He flicked on the flashing reds and blues. Felix sighed, his broad shoulders dropping slightly. He pulled the Shelby smoothly onto the shoulder, turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and turned on the interior dome light. He placed his large, calloused hands flat on the top of the steering wheel, where they were clearly visible. Jenkins approached the car like a hunter cornering wounded prey. He didn't unpip his flashlight. Instead, he kept his hand resting aggressively on the butt of his service weapon. "License and registration," Jenkins barked, shining his high-beam tactical light directly into Felix's eyes, deliberately trying to disorient him. "Good evening, officer," Felix said, his voice a deep, calm baritone that betrayed no fear. "My wallet is in my back right pocket, and my registration is in the glove compartment. I need to reach for them. Is that all right?" Jenkins scoffed, leaning in closer, the smell of stale coffee and stale cigarettes radiating off his uniform. "Don't play games with me, boy. Just hand it over. Felix's jaw tightened imperceptibly at the slur, but his discipline held firm. Slowly, deliberately, he retrieved his identification and handed it through the window. Jenkins snatched the cards, barely looking at them before glaring back at Felix. "Whose car is this? You steal it from one of the houses up the hill." "The registration matches my license, officer," Felix replied evenly. "It is my vehicle." "Step out of the car," Jenkins ordered suddenly, taking a step back and unholstering his taser. "Officer, I haven't committed a traffic violation. May I ask why I am being ordered out of my vehicle?" "You're being ordered out because I said so," Jenkins shouted, his face flushing red. "Get out of the damn car right now, or I'll drag you out." Felix knew the law and he knew his rights, but he also knew the grim statistics of nights exactly like this one. Moving with slow, deliberate precision, he opened the door and stepped out into the freezing rain. Despite his age, Felix stood an imposing 6'2", his posture ramrod straight. For a fleeting second, Jenkins felt a flicker of intimidation, which only fueled his aggressive overcompensation. Without warning, Jenkins grabbed Felix by the shoulder, spinning him violently and slamming his chest against the side of the pristine Shelby. "Hands behind your back," Jenkins yelled, kicking Felix's legs apart roughly. "I am not resisting, officer," Felix stated firmly, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. He allowed himself to be handcuffed. The cold steel biting into his wrists, Jenkins began aggressively patting Felix down, emptying his pockets and tossing the contents onto the wet trunk of the car. Finding nothing but a phone, a set of keys, and some loose change, Jenkins grew frustrated. "Wait here," Jenkins sneered, shoving Felix against the rear quarter panel of the car. Jenkins then opened the driver's side door and began tearing through the interior of the Shelby. He ripped the contents of the glove box out, tossed the floor mats into the mud, and aggressively pried at the center console. It was an illegal, warrantless search, entirely devoid of probable cause. Felix watched silently, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He was committing every detail, every badge number, every word to memory. Jenkins was digging his own grave, and Felix was going to let him shovel as deep as he wanted. The drive to the 44th precinct was suffocating. Felix sat in the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the cruiser, his hands agonizingly pinned beneath his own weight. The handcuffs had been applied tightly, entirely ignoring standard protocol, cutting off circulation to his fingers. Jenkins drove erratically, taking corners too fast, intentionally trying to throw Felix off balance. "You're going away for a long time, old man," Jenkins taunted from the front seat, adjusting the rearview mirror so he could glare at his captive. "I know your type. Smooth talker, nice suit, stolen car. We're going to find out what you're really up to." Felix did not respond. His silence seemed to infuriate Jenkins even more. For a bully, there is nothing more maddening than a victim who refuses to break. They arrived at the precinct, a brutalist concrete building that smelled of floor wax, stale sweat, and despair. Jenkins hauled Felix out of the cruiser by the chain of his handcuffs, a move designed purely to inflict pain in the shoulders. Felix stumbled slightly but caught his footing, refusing to give Jenkins the satisfaction of a groan. As they walked through the bullpen, several officers looked up. Some looked away quickly, uncomfortable with Jenkins' overt brutality. Others, part of Jenkins' toxic clique, smirked. Sergeant David Miller, a weary 15-year veteran, was manning the intake desk. Miller wasn't inherently malicious, but he was a coward. He had spent his career turning a blind eye to the bad apples in the department to protect his own pension. "What do we have here, Brad?" Miller asked, sighing as he pulled a fresh booking sheet toward him. "Got a live one, Sarge," Jenkins announced loudly, puffing out his chest. "Caught him prowling up in Oak Ridge. Refused lawful orders, resisting arrest, the works. I had to get physical to subdue him." Miller looked at Felix. He saw a man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored wool coat, bleeding slightly from a scrape on his cheek where Jenkins had slammed him against the car. He didn't look like a prowler. He looked like a CEO. "Name?" Miller asked, his voice flat. "Felix Pendleton?" Felix replied, his voice still that steady, unshakable baritone. "He's a liar," Jenkins interrupted, throwing a small clear plastic baggie onto the intake desk. Inside was a white, powdery substance. "Found this stuffed down in the seams of his back seat during my inventory search. Looks like we're adding felony possession with intent to distribute to the list." The bullpen went dead silent. Miller stared at the baggie, then back at Jenkins. "Brad, you found this in the car. You calling me a liar, Dave?" Jenkins challenged, his hand resting on his belt. Miller swallowed hard. He knew Jenkins was planting evidence. It wasn't the first time Jenkins had suddenly found narcotics on a suspect who was giving him a hard time, but Miller also knew that crossing Jenkins meant crossing the Union, which meant his life at the precinct would become a living hell. "No," Miller muttered, looking down at his desk. "No, I'm not. Booking him on possession." Felix looked at the bag of powder. Then he looked directly into Jenkins' eyes. There was no fear in Felix's gaze. There was only a cold, clinical calculation. It was the look of a predator evaluating its prey. Jenkins felt an inexplicable shiver run down his spine, but he quickly shook it off, attributing it to the damp cold of his uniform. "I am entitled to my phone call," Felix said calmly. Yeah, you'll get your call, Pablo Escobar," Jenkins sneered, shoving Felix toward the holding cells. Felix was locked in a stark cinder-block cell. The door slammed shut with a final echoing clang. He sat on the metal bench, ignoring the throbbing pain in his wrists and the chill of the damp room. An hour passed. Then 2. Jenkins walked by occasionally to mock him, drinking coffee and laughing with the other night shift officers. He regaled them with exaggerated tales of how Felix had supposedly tried to fight him on the side of the road. Finally, Sergeant Miller approached the cell bars, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "You want to make your call now?" "Yes," Felix said simply. He was led to a wall-mounted telephone in the hallway. Miller dialed the outside line for him. Felix punched in a number from memory. It didn't go to a local bail bondsman. It didn't go to a sleepy public defender. It went directly to an emergency line in Washington, D.C. "It's Felix," he said when the line picked up. "I'm at the 44th Precinct in Oak Ridge County, holding cell 3. Unlawful arrest. Planted evidence. Activate the protocol." He hung up the phone and turned to Miller. "I will wait in my cell." Miller frowned, deeply unnerved by the interaction. Suspects usually screamed, cried, begged, or threatened lawsuits. They didn't speak in code and willingly walked back into a cage. "Who did you call?" Miller asked nervously. Felix offered a slight chilling smile. "The consequences." It took exactly 45 minutes for the atmosphere in the 44th Precinct to shift from a lazy night shift to absolute panic. It started when the heavy glass double doors of the precinct were violently shoved open. The freezing wind blew in, but it was nothing compared to the storm that had just walked through the door. Leading the charge was Chief Thomas Higgins, the head of the Oak Ridge Police Department. Chief Higgins was a man who preferred sleeping in his warm bed at 3:30 a.m., not rushing down to a precinct half-dressed in his uniform pants and a wrinkled trench coat. His face was pale, glistening with a terrified sweat, and he was flanked by 2 stern-looking men in immaculate dark suits holding heavy leather briefcases. Behind them walked a woman in her early 30s. She possessed an intense, commanding aura. She wore a sharp, tailored pantsuit, a trench coat, and heels that clicked against the linoleum floor with the rhythmic, terrifying cadence of a ticking time bomb. This was Chloe Pendleton, one of the most ruthless, high-powered civil rights attorneys on the East Coast, and Felix's daughter. "Who the hell is the commanding officer on duty?" Chief Higgins bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. The bullpen froze. Officers stopped typing. Coffee cups were lowered. Sergeant Miller stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and slammed into the wall. "I am, Chief," Miller stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Is there a problem?" "Where is he?" Higgins demanded, marching up to the intake desk and slamming his hand down. "Where is the man you brought in tonight?" Felix Pendleton, from across the room, Jenkins, who had been leaning against a filing cabinet, laughed arrogantly. "Relax, Chief. He's in holding cell 3. Just another drug-dealing street thug. Thought he could resist arrest, but I handled it." Chloe Pendleton slowly turned her gaze to Jenkins. Her eyes were a dark, furious storm. "You handled it," she repeated, her voice deceptively quiet, carrying across the silent room. "You handled a retired colonel of the United States Marine Corps, a 2-time Silver Star recipient, the current senior consulting director for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division." The words hung in the air like a localized earthquake. Jenkins' arrogant smirk evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. "That's right," one of the men in the dark suit said, stepping forward and flashing a gold badge. "Special Agent Reynolds, FBI. We're here to take custody of Colonel Pendleton, and we are formally seizing all records, body cam footage, and physical evidence related to his detainment." Chief, this is a mistake," Jenkins stuttered, backing away slightly. "He had drugs in his car. I found cocaine in his back seat. He's a criminal. Shut your damn mouth, Jenkins." Higgins roared, spittle flying from his lips. He turned to Miller, his hands shaking. "Get the keys. Get him out of that cell right now." "Not possible. What?" Miller scrambled for the keys, practically running down the hallway to holding cell 3. When he unlocked the door, Felix was sitting exactly where he had left him, his posture still perfect, his expression entirely neutral. "Mr. Pendleton. I mean, Colonel," Miller stuttered, his hands trembling violently. You're free to go." Felix stood up, smoothing the front of his coat. He walked out of the cell and back into the bullpen. When he emerged, his daughter Chloe immediately stepped past the yellow line and embraced him tightly. "Are you hurt?" she whispered fiercely. "Just my pride, sweetheart," Felix murmured back, though he winced slightly as she brushed his bruised shoulder. Chief Higgins stepped forward, looking as though he might drop to his knees and beg. "Colonel Pendleton, words cannot express how incredibly sorry I am for this catastrophic misunderstanding. I assure you Officer Jenkins will be severely disciplined. This is not who we are." Felix looked at the chief, then slowly turned his gaze to Jenkins, who was now sweating profusely, looking desperately around the room for support from officers who were actively taking steps away from him. "Chief Higgins," Felix said, his baritone voice echoing in the dead-silent precinct. "Your officer didn't make a mistake. A mistake is writing the wrong date on a ticket. Your officer violently assaulted me, unlawfully searched my property, and when he found nothing, he planted narcotics in my vehicle to justify a false imprisonment." "Now, wait a minute," Jenkins yelled, desperation making his voice shrill. "It's your word against mine. You can't prove I planted anything. That dope was in your car." Chloe opened a briefcase and pulled out a sleek tablet. "Actually, Officer Jenkins, we can prove it. You see, my father's 1968 Shelby isn't just a classic car. It was fully retrofitted last year by a high-end security firm." She tapped the screen and a high-definition video began playing. She turned the tablet around so the entire room could see. The footage was crystal clear, recorded from a hidden 360-degree interior camera mounted in the headliner of the Shelby. It showed Jenkins tearing through the car. Then it showed Jenkins reaching into his own tactical vest, pulling out a small plastic baggie of white powder, and deliberately shoving it deep into the crevice of the back seat. The camera even captured the audio of Jenkins muttering, "Let's see you talk your way out of this, you rich piece of trash." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a man's life ending. Jenkins stared at the screen, his breathing ragged. He took a step backward, bumping into a desk. That's doctored. That's fake. Special Agent Reynolds, Felix said calmly, looking at the FBI agent. I would like to press federal charges under Title 18, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. And I want him arrested, right now. Not a. The command from Felix Pendleton didn't just echo. It struck the room with the kinetic force of a gavel slamming down on a wooden block. For 10 years, Bradley Jenkins had operated under the absolute certainty that the badge on his chest was an impenetrable shield. He had bullied, beaten, and framed his way through a decade of police work, always protected by the deeply ingrained blue wall of silence. But as Special Agent Reynolds stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy federal-issue handcuffs from his belt, that shield shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Bradley Jenkins, Agent Reynolds said, his voice devoid of any emotion, the clinical tone of a professional executing a mandate. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Not tall, armed, and much circle. Jenkins' eyes darted wildly around the bullpen. He looked at Sergeant Miller, who immediately dropped his gaze to his shoes. He looked at Chief Higgins, who was actively taking a step backward, distancing himself from the radioactive fallout. Finally, Jenkins looked at the other night shift officers, the same men who, just 30 minutes prior, had laughed at his exaggerated stories of subduing a street thug. None of them moved. None of them spoke. "Chief," Jenkins pleaded, his voice cracking, shedding the tough guy persona in a matter of seconds. "Chief, you can't let them do this. We have a protocol. Internal Affairs has to investigate first. I have union rights. Internal Affairs has zero jurisdiction over a federal civil rights violation, Mr. Jenkins," Chloe Pendleton interrupted, her voice slicing through his panic like a scalpel. She intentionally dropped his title. He wasn't an officer to her anymore. He was a criminal suspect. And your union representative was notified 10 minutes ago. He advised that you comply with federal authorities. Turn around. Jenkins trembled. The utter humiliation of being arrested in his own precinct in front of his peers by the FBI was a psychological blow that completely broke him. Slowly, numbly, he turned around. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Jenkins' wrists was the loudest noise in the precinct. "Bradley Jenkins, you are under arrest for the deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and evidence tampering," Reynolds recited calmly as he tightened the steel. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Reynolds read the Miranda warning, Chloe turned her piercing gaze to Sergeant Miller. Miller physically flinched under her stare. "Sergeant Miller," Chloe said, stepping up to the intake desk. She leaned in, keeping her voice low enough that only he and her father could hear, but laced with enough venom to make Miller's blood run cold. "I saw the booking report. You signed off on the possession charge without verifying the chain of custody. You knew Jenkins was planting evidence, you knew his history, and you processed an innocent man anyway to protect your pension." I didn't know," Miller stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "I just process what the arresting officer brings in." You assumed wrong," Felix said, stepping beside his daughter. His voice was heavy, carrying the weight of a man who had seen true honor and was disgusted by the lack of it here. "Cowardice is a choice, Sergeant, and your choice tonight has made you an accessory." Chief Higgins nervously wiped his brow with a trembling hand. "Colonel Pendleton, Miss Pendleton, please, we can handle Miller internally. Jenkins is the bad apple here. I give you my word, the Oak Ridge Police Department will launch a full, transparent review." "Save your breath, Thomas," Felix cut him off, using the chief's first name to establish absolute dominance. "Your department is rotten to the foundation. You don't get to investigate yourselves anymore. As of tomorrow morning, the Department of Justice will be taking over." Higgins' face went entirely slack. A DOJ consent decree meant the end of his career. It meant federal monitors auditing every arrest, every budget line, and every use of force report. It meant the absolute dismantling of his power. Agent Reynolds. Felix nodded to the FBI agent holding a thoroughly broken Jenkins by the arm. Get him out of my sight. Jenkins was led away, his head hung low, shuffling in the same awkward, humiliating manner he had forced Felix to endure just hours earlier as he was marched out the heavy glass double doors into the freezing rain. A local news van was already screeching to a halt at the curb. The flashing lights of the cameras illuminated Jenkins' tear-streaked face. Chloe had ensured the press was tipped off. The narrative belonged to them now. Felix retrieved his belongings from the evidence desk. He pocketed his phone and his keys, buttoned his wool coat, and walked out of the precinct with his daughter. He didn't look back. Behind him, the 44th precinct was descending into a chaotic frenzy as officers scrambled to scrub their own records, knowing the federal storm was about to make landfall. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the footage from Felix Shelby was playing on an endless, devastating loop on every major national news network. The story was a media juggernaut. A racist, corrupt cop caught red-handed planting drugs on a highly decorated black Marine veteran who happened to work for the DOJ. It was the perfect storm of undeniable visual evidence and a victim who was entirely unimpeachable. The Oak Ridge mayor, Richard Sterling, immediately held a panic press conference, profusely apologizing to Felix and promising swift justice. But apologies were meaningless in the face of the hurricane Coe Pendleton was orchestrating. Frank Gallagher, the heavy-set combative president of the local police union, attempted to mount a defense. In a hastily arranged radio interview, Gallagher argued that the hidden camera in the Shelby constituted an illegal, unconsented recording, and that the footage should be thrown out in court. Officer Jenkins is a decorated public servant, Gallagher barked over the airwaves. This so-called video was captured without his consent, violating his expectation of privacy during a routine traffic stop. This is a witch hunt against law enforcement. Chloe didn't wait for a courtroom to dismantle Gallagher's argument. She went on a primetime evening broadcast that same night. Mr. Gallagher's understanding of the law is as flawed as his moral compass, Chloe stated calmly to the anchor, staring directly into the camera. There is no expectation of privacy for a public servant performing a public duty on a public roadway. Furthermore, the interior of my father's vehicle is his private property. The camera was entirely lawful. But let's not get distracted by the union's desperate legal gymnastics. The real question the public should be asking is this: where did Bradley Jenkins get the cocaine he planted in my father's car? That single question dropped like a nuclear bomb on the Oak Ridge Police Department. It was a thread that no one at the precinct had considered in their panic. Jenkins had pulled the baggie of white powder from his tactical vest. Cops don't casually manufacture narcotics. If Jenkins had it ready to use as drop gear, he acquired it from somewhere. The morning after Chloe's interview, 50 heavily armed FBI agents and DOJ investigators descended on the Oak Ridge Police Department headquarters and the 44th precinct simultaneously. They did not knock. They walked in with federal warrants signed by a federal judge, physically removing officers from their desks and confiscating their computers, cell phones, and physical files. Agent Reynolds personally led the team down into the basement of the 44th precinct to the evidence locker. The custodian, Detective Greg Larson, a nervous man who had been friends with Jenkins for years, tried to block the door. "I need to see a warrant," Larson demanded, his voice shaking. Reynolds slapped the paperwork against Larson's chest. "Step aside, detective. We're auditing your entire inventory." The federal audit took 3 days. The results were catastrophic. The DOJ discovered massive, glaring discrepancies in the narcotics evidence logs. Dozens of pounds of confiscated drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin were unaccounted for over a 5-year period. The investigation revealed a highly coordinated ring within the department. Detectives like Larson were skimming drugs from major busts before logging them and funneling small amounts to street-level officers like Jenkins to use for planting evidence on suspects who talked back or didn't comply fast enough. It was a systematic, institutionalized method of ensuring convictions and boosting arrest quotas. What started as a single civil rights violation against Felix Pendleton had rapidly metastasized into a massive racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's RICO Act case. Back in the county jail, Bradley Jenkins was experiencing a terrifying new reality. Because he was a former police officer charged with federal crimes, he was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. The irony was suffocating. He was trapped in a concrete box, identical to the ones he had gleefully thrown innocent people into for years. When his public defender, the union, had officially abandoned him once the RICO charges dropped, visited him on the 5th day, Jenkins was a hollow shell of the arrogant predator he used to be. They're offering a plea deal, the weary public defender stated, sliding a thick manila envelope across the metal table in the visitation room. But it's contingent on you giving up everyone involved in the evidence-skimming ring. Larson, Sergeant Miller, whoever else. Jenkins stared at the table, his hands shackled to the waist chain. What's the offer? If you testify against the department, 20 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole before serving 85% of the sentence. Jenkins gagged, the blood draining from his face. 20 years for one baggie of coke. That's insane. Tell them I'll fight it. You'll go to trial. The lawyer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Brad, listen to me. They have the HD video of you planting the drugs. They have the audit proving the drugs came from your own precinct. And as of this morning, they have Sergeant Miller. Jenkins' head snapped up. Miller. Miller broke, the lawyer said grimly. He couldn't handle the pressure of the DOJ breathing down his neck. He accepted an immunity deal. He gave them everything. He testified that you bragged about keeping drop gear in your vest for special occasions. If you go to trial, they are going to stack the deprivation of rights charge, the evidence tampering, and the federal racketeering charges. The judge will give you life without parole. This 20-year deal is the absolute best you're ever going to get. Jenkins began to weep. It wasn't a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was a loud, ugly, hyperventilating panic. The walls of his own arrogance had finally caved in, crushing him entirely. He had picked on a quiet black man in a nice car, assuming he was a nameless victim who could be easily erased. Instead, he had unknowingly pulled the pin on a grenade that blew up his life, his career, and his entire corrupt department. I'll sign it, Jenkins sobbed, burying his face in his shackled hands. I'll sign whatever they want. Meanwhile, Felix Pendleton sat on the front porch of his Oak Ridge home, sipping a cup of black coffee. The morning air was crisp, and the autumn sun was just beginning to burn off the dew. His Shelby GT500 was parked in the driveway, completely detailed and looking as pristine as ever. His phone buzzed on the table. It was Chloe. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice bright. "Just got off the phone with the U.S. Attorney's office." Jenkins took the plea. 20 years. And Larson and 3 others were indicted this morning. Chief Higgins was forced into early retirement and stripped of his pension pending the investigation. Felix took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the quiet, peaceful street. He felt no vindictiveness, no triumphant joy. He just felt the quiet satisfaction of a battlefield where the enemy had been decisively routed. "Good work, Chloe," Felix said quietly. "Good work." But the story of Oak Ridge wasn't quite finished. While Jenkins was headed to federal prison and the corrupt core of the precinct was being excised, the fallout of the DOJ investigation was about to uncover a secret so massive it would drag the town's highest-ranking officials straight into the light. The rot, it turned out, didn't stop at the police department. It went all the way to City Hall. While Bradley Jenkins traded his tailored police uniform for a coarse, oversized federal prison jumpsuit, the true architects of Oak Ridge County's misery were desperately trying to cover their tracks. Chief Thomas Higgins was merely a middle manager in a much larger, far more insidious syndicate. The head of the snake was sitting in a leather chair on the top floor of the municipal building, Mayor Richard Sterling. Mayor Sterling was a polished, charismatic politician in his late 50s. He wore $5,000 Bryony suits, sported a perfectly maintained silver mane, and had spent the last 8 years running Oak Ridge under the guise of an uncompromising, tough-on-crime agenda. But behind closed doors, Sterling ran the city like a cartel boss. The DOJ's discovery of the missing narcotics in the 44th precinct was the loose thread that threatened to unravel Sterling's entire empire. The drugs weren't just being skimmed to plant on uncooperative suspects. That was merely a side benefit for aggressive foot soldiers like Jenkins. The bulk of the confiscated heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine was being quietly funneled back onto the streets through a network of protected dealers. The profits from this shadow operation were astronomical, but drug money is notoriously difficult to launder. That was where the second, even more sinister branch of the conspiracy came in: civil asset forfeiture. Felix Pendleton, sitting at the massive mahogany dining table in his home, was reviewing a stack of financial documents with his daughter, Chloe, and Special Agent Reynolds. To break the financial web, Felix had called in a personal favor from the private sector. He had enlisted the services of Harrison Gable, a highly respected former IRS criminal investigator who now ran Gable Financial Forensics out of Washington, D.C. Harrison was a relentless bulldog with a ledger, a man who could find a missing dollar in a hurricane of shell corporations. "The math doesn't lie, Felix," Harrison said, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose as he tapped a dense spreadsheet. Over the last 6 years, the Oak Ridge Police Department has executed over 400 civil asset forfeiture seizures. They seized cash, jewelry, and most importantly, real estate and high-end vehicles. Chloe crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on the data. Civil asset forfeiture allows law enforcement to seize property they claim is involved in a crime, even if the owner is never actually charged or convicted. The burden of proof has shifted to the citizen to prove their property is innocent. Exactly, Harrison nodded. But look at the demographics of the seizures. 90% of these seizures targeted Black and Hispanic residents or out-of-town minorities passing through Oak Ridge. Officers like Jenkins were explicitly instructed to profile, pull over, and harass these specific demographics. If they found cash, they seized it, claiming it was drug money. If they couldn't find a reason, they planted the drop gear they skimmed from the evidence locker to manufacture a felony. Agent Reynolds leaned forward, his jaw tight. And once the arrest was made, the city seized the vehicles and the homes. But where did the assets go, Harrison? Harrison pulled up a new document, bearing the official seal of the county clerk's office. By law, seized assets are supposed to be auctioned off to fund public services, but Oak Ridge structured their auctions privately, with zero public notice. The seized homes, the classic cars, they were all purchased for pennies on the dollar by a single holding company, Oak Ridge Development Partners, LLC. "Let me guess," Felix said, his deep voice rumbling with quiet fury. "Mayor Sterling. Through 3 layers of offshore corporate shielding in the Cayman Islands, yes," Harrison confirmed. Sterling's shell company buys the seized properties at auction using the laundered drug money. They flip the houses, gentrify the neighborhoods, and sell them to wealthy connected buyers for millions in clean, untraceable profit. Jenkins and the patrol cops thought they were just being encouraged to be aggressive. They didn't realize they were real estate acquirers for the mayor's private portfolio. The revelation was chilling. Felix hadn't just been pulled over by a racist cop having a bad night. He was targeted by a systemic municipal machine designed to strip wealth from minorities under the guise of law enforcement. Jenkins saw a black man in a $100,000 1968 Shelby GT500 and saw a prime target for a vehicle seizure. Had Felix been anyone else, Jenkins would have planted the cocaine, Felix would have been buried under a mountain of legal debt fighting a felony charge, and Mayor Sterling's shell company would have bought the Shelby at a rigged auction for $2,000. We have the wire transfers, the rigged auction logs, and the offshore account routing numbers, Chloe said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous predatory light. Sterling used the police department as a violent taxpayer-funded collection agency. It's time to cut the head off the snake. Agent Reynolds stood up, picking up his suit jacket. I'll draft the federal arrest warrants tonight. We move on City Hall tomorrow morning. Felix stood as well, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the dining room. I want to be there, Agent Reynolds. When you put the cuffs on him, I want to look him in the eye. You earned the front row seat, Colonel, Reynolds replied grimly. Across town, Mayor Richard Sterling was pacing furiously in his opulent wood-paneled office. The news of Sergeant Miller's immunity deal and Jenkins' guilty plea had sent him into a paranoid spiral. He was hastily feeding documents into an industrial shredder while his private defense attorney pleaded with him on speakerphone to remain calm. "Richard, you need to stop panicking," the lawyer's tinny voice echoed. "Jenkins is an idiot foot soldier. He doesn't know about Oak Ridge Development Partners. Even Higgins only knows half the picture. The corporate deal is secure. The DOJ is auditing the precinct." Sterling shouted, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. "They're bringing in forensic accountants. If they look at the forfeiture logs, they are looking for civil rights violations, Richard, not financial crimes. Stay on message. You are the reformer mayor who was shocked by the rogue actions of a few bad apples. Hold a press conference tomorrow. Project Confidence." Sterling took a deep breath, smoothing his expensive tie. His lawyer was right. He had insulated himself perfectly. The paperwork was buried under layers of corporate obfuscation. He just needed to play the role of the outraged, betrayed leader. He was, after all, a politician. Lying was his primary language. "You're right," Sterling muttered, turning off the shredder. "I'm holding a town hall tomorrow at noon. I'm going to publicly condemn the police department and promise a new era of transparency." He had no idea that his new era was going to be spent behind federal bars. The municipal auditorium was packed to capacity the following day. News crews from every major network had set up their cameras in the back, the red recording lights glowing like predatory eyes in the dim room. The citizens of Oak Ridge, outraged and betrayed by the viral footage of Felix's arrest, filled the seats, holding signs demanding accountability. At exactly noon, Mayor Richard Sterling walked onto the stage. He had perfected the look of somber determination. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the restless crowd. "Citizens of Oak Ridge," Sterling began, his voice resonant and deeply practiced. "The events of this past week have left a dark stain on our beautiful community. The horrific actions of former Officer Bradley Jenkins and the subsequent discoveries of corruption within the 44th Precinct are a betrayal of the public trust. As your mayor, I stand before you today to say I am disgusted. I am heartbroken, but most importantly, I am taking action." The crowd murmured, a mix of skepticism and desperate hope. "Effective immediately," Sterling boomed, raising a fist for dramatic effect. "I am calling for the complete dissolution of the current police leadership. We will root out the bad apples, no matter how deep the rot goes. I promise you, under my administration, no one is above the law." "I completely agree, Mr. Mayor." The voice did not come from the crowd. It came from the heavy double doors at the side of the auditorium. The entire room turned, striding down the center aisle, moving with the synchronized, unstoppable momentum of an incoming tide, was Special Agent Reynolds, flanked by a dozen FBI agents wearing tactical vests. Right behind them walked Chloe Pendleton, her expression cold and unyielding, and Felix Pendleton walking with the straight-backed, commanding presence of a Marine colonel surveying a conquered battlefield. Mayor Sterling's heart slammed against his ribs. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting under the stage lights. "What is the meaning of this?" Sterling demanded, his voice cracking, the polished politician facade instantly crumbling. "We are in the middle of a press conference. You have no jurisdiction here." Agent Reynolds didn't slow his pace. He marched directly up the stairs onto the stage, producing a thick stack of legal documents. The cameras in the back of the room zoomed in, capturing every agonizing second of the mayor's public implosion. "Richard Sterling," Reynolds announced, his voice projecting clearly through the auditorium without the need for a microphone. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, money laundering, wire fraud, and the conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights." The auditorium erupted. Gasps, shouts, and the frantic clicking of camera shutters filled the air. Sterling stumbled backward, bumping into the podium and knocking it over with a loud crash. "This is a stunt. This is a political witch hunt. You have no proof of anything." Chloe Pendleton stepped forward, standing at the edge of the stage. She held up a thick manila folder. "We have the forensic audit from Harrison Gable. We have the offshore routing numbers from the Cayman Islands. We know about Oak Ridge Development Partners, Richard. We know you used the police department to falsely arrest minorities so you could steal their homes and their cars through rigged civil asset forfeiture auctions." Sterling's eyes darted wildly, searching for an exit, but FBI agents had already secured the perimeter. He looked down at Felix Pendleton. Felix looked back, his expression entirely devoid of pity. "You built an empire by preying on people you thought had no voice. You thought a badge and a gavel made you untouchable. You were wrong." Agent Reynolds grabbed Sterling by the arm, spinning him around forcefully. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the microphone that lay discarded on the floor. "Richard Sterling, you have the right to remain silent," Reynolds recited, parading the mayor across the stage in front of the flashing cameras. "I highly suggest you finally use it." As the mayor was marched out of his own town hall in disgrace, the crowd erupted into deafening applause. It wasn't just a political scandal, it was the surgical removal of a cancer that had been slowly killing the city for a decade. 200 miles away, in the recreation room of a federal penitentiary, Bradley Jenkins sat on a metal folding chair, staring blankly at the television screen. The news anchors were gleefully breaking down the arrest of Mayor Sterling, detailing the massive money laundering and property theft ring. As Jenkins watched the detailed graphics explaining how the mayor had used patrol cops as unwitting real estate acquisition thugs, a crushing, nauseating realization washed over him. He had thought he was a king on the streets, wielding supreme power over the citizens he terrorized. He had ruined lives, planted evidence, and committed perjury, believing he was the ultimate authority. In reality, he was nothing but a disposable, pathetic pawn. The mayor had used his racism and his aggression to steal property, and the second Jenkins became a liability. The mayor, the chief, and the union had thrown him to the wolves to protect the real money. Jenkins had traded 20 years of his life, his freedom, and his humanity just to help a corrupt politician buy a third vacation home. He buried his face in his hands, weeping bitter, useless tears in a room where no one cared. Over the next 6 months, the Oak Ridge Police Department was entirely dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up under federal supervision. The DOJ mandated sweeping reforms, the abolition of the city's civil asset forfeiture program, and the implementation of strict, unforgiving oversight. Over 40 officers were indicted, fired, or forced into early retirement. Properties that had been illegally seized were returned to their rightful owners, alongside millions of dollars in restitution paid out from Sterling's seized offshore accounts. Richard Sterling pleaded not guilty, fighting the charges with expensive lawyers, but the paper trail Harrison Gable had uncovered was impenetrable. A federal jury found Sterling guilty on all 34 counts. He was sentenced to 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, a sentence that effectively guaranteed he would die behind bars. On a bright, clear Saturday morning in early spring, Felix Pendleton walked out of his front door. The neighborhood was quiet, the air smelling of blooming jasmine and fresh rain. He walked down his driveway and ran his hand along the pristine, polished fender of his midnight blue 1968 Shelby GT 500. Chloe came out onto the porch, holding 2 cups of coffee. She smiled at her father, taking her for a spin. I think I will, Felix smiled back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He opened the heavy door and slid into the driver's seat. He turned the key, and the massive engine roared to life, a deep, triumphant rumble that vibrated in his chest. He didn't have to look over his shoulder anymore. The shadows had been chased away, the predators had been caged, and the road ahead was finally completely clear. Felix shifted into gear, the tires gripping the asphalt, and drove off into the morning light, leaving the ruins of a corrupt empire entirely in his rearview mirror. When absolute arrogance collides with an immovable pillar of justice, the fallout is always spectacular. Bradley Jenkins and Mayor Sterling believed they had built an untouchable machine, exploiting the vulnerable to line their own pockets while hiding behind a badge and a political office. But they made the fatal mistake of targeting a man who possessed not only the courage to stand his ground, but the connections to tear their corrupt empire out by its roots. Karma didn't just knock on their door, it kicked it down with federal warrants in hand. If this story of ultimate justice, systemic takedowns, and hard-hitting karma kept you on the edge of your seat, do not forget to hit that like button. Share this incredible real-life inspired drama with your friends, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping stories of corruption meeting its match. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Felix's shoes? See you in the next video.